is making progress on that front under its new president, the former MasterCard chairman, Ajay Banga. Well, among those partnering the bank is one of the world's biggest philanthropic organisations, the Rockefeller Foundation. Well, joining me now from Washington is Eric Pelofsky. He's the vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Eric, welcome to you. Before we talk about the spring meetings, you've worked across Middle East conflict zones. I'd love to know your thoughts on where this situation goes from here.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me. Look, I think right now everybody has taken a deep breath and is looking at whether the escalation path that's in front of them is really desirable. And I think most of the countries looking at it will decide that it's not. But I think there's going to need to be some serious persuasion in some cases to make sure that the escalation doesn't get out of hand. I think you could expect at least one more reply, but that has to be carefully calibrated so that it doesn't leap up the escalation chain.
I mean, Iran's attack on Israel was obviously well telegraphed, and Israel was supported by the US, the UK and France, among others. Could it hold its own against Iran in the event of an all-out war?
Well, I don't think anybody generally goes anywhere betting against the Israeli military. But on the other hand, there is an infinite amount of soft belly around the world. And I think that one should not miscalibrate around that. I think that if you have the Israelis in a direct conflict with Iran, there are real possibilities of collateral and also escalation from other countries, none of which would be obviously a good thing.
Obviously, you spend a great deal of your time dealing with what one might describe as the global south. I mean, I've seen it suggested that this particular issue has been weaponised to turn the global south against the West, the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU and so on. Is that a cause of concern for you?
Well, I think it realistically, the global south is watching this amongst a million other things. And frankly, they're more focused on their set of problems. Obviously, there are actors in this geopolitical stage that would try to weaponize it. But frankly, I think if you're a finance minister who's coming to the World Bank and the IMF meetings here in Washington, you're going to be focused on your budget, your fiscal space, your debt burden, the climate challenges that are affecting your economy. I don't think that top of their list is the U.S. And Israel and Iran or anybody else in a conflict. So I don't think that's where their heads are at.
Now, you've been leading the foundation's work on the so-called Bridgetown agenda, this move to try and cut borrowing costs for poor countries. What progress is being made on that front?
Well, we're part of the support network that Prime Minister Motley, President Ruto, President Akufo-Addo are looking to be helpful. But they're really leading the charge. We're trying to bring the policy options and the support network, but they're the real leaders. And I think they have made considerable progress in, first of all, focusing the world's attention on what options there are to change their reality and our reality. Frankly, everything they do affects the global north, the emissions that are going into the world. And so I think you look at the balance sheet of the bank, you look at some of the climate resilient debt clauses that have been adopted, you've seen considerable progress. But the problem is the magnitude of the crisis on climate and on debt is just not being touched by the steps that have been taken thus far. There are small impacts, they're getting bigger, but they need to be at a different scale of magnitude to have a real impact.
But nonetheless, would you argue that progress is being made in terms of helping the global south transition away from carbon?
Ian, unfortunately, I think that the transition is fully focused, but the amount of renewables that are going into the developing world is a minuscule percentage of the renewable energy transition that's taking place globally. Most of that transition is taking place in the OECD countries, in the developed world. And as a result of that, we're really missing the boat, because when it comes to it in the next decade, 3/4 of the emissions growth is going to be in the developing world, and that problem is not being dealt with. It really has to have a considerable focus by the World Bank, the IMF, and of course, folks are aware of the problem. The solutions just aren't at the scale that they need to be in order to make a difference.
Which are the countries where attention is most pressingly needed?
Well, I think you've got the high emitters in the middle income, and you've also got all of the developing world. So, I think to try and single out a country where there's, you're going to make a single impact and it's going to be, silver bullet. I don't think there are silver bullets in this case. Obviously, India, Mexico, Brazil, they all are middle income countries that are making, their way through the energy transition. And they need attention, but fact of the matter is low income countries need just as much attention.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned India because, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, hang on, India is sufficiently prosperous to be able to send a rocket to the moon now. Do they really need the support of an organisation like the World Bank?
Well, I think but the immense challenges that India face are very significant. And I don't think that we should just sort of say, you've graduated to the point where we don't need to pay attention to you. And I think there is a need for the World Bank to, and much as these institutions do, walk and chew gum at the same time. And Ian, I'm absolutely convinced that these institutions can do it. They just need, and we've got a real leader like Ajay Banga, but we really do need the institutions to make a step change in the way they're affecting this. This is not, incremental change. We need paradigm shift in the way these organizations are taking on the problem.
All right, Eric, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Do appreciate you spending the time to chat to us today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Some other business news stories for you now. And the price of oil has fallen while equities have risen today as markets appear to have taken Iran's attack on Israel at the weekend in their stride. While the Israeli war cabinet is undecided on how to respond to Iran's attack, Brent crude, which finished at $90.45 a barrel on Friday evening, has today traded as low as $89.21 a barrel. Well, speaking to me a little earlier, Henry Allen, the macro strategist at Deutsche Bank, outlined dangers to the wider global economy.
I think the biggest risk is not just what happens to the oil price, because people are factoring that in to some extent, but the biggest risk is what economists recall second-round effects, which is basically where, oil prices go up, for instance, but because firms like supermarkets, for example, use oil, have energy costs, they then start passing those costs on into other goods and services. So actually, what you can see is that you get an oil shock, and then other prices start to rise as well, which is how that inflation becomes more broad-based, more concerning, the sort of thing that central banks would need to react to.
Tesla is to lay off more than 10% of its global workforce, according to an internal memo seen by Reuters. The world's largest car maker by market value employs 140,000 people globally, but it's grappling with falling sales and an intense price war among electric vehicle manufacturers. The memo, reportedly written by the chief executive Elon Musk, said Tesla is looking at every aspect of the company for cost reductions and increasing productivity. Tesla, whose shares have fallen by more than 30% this year, has not responded to the reports. The international motor dealer Inchcape has sold its UK retail operations for £346 million to the US motor dealer Group 1 Automotive. The business employs around 3,600 people in more than 80 sites and partners with car makers including Jaguar Land Rover, Volkswagen, Toyota and BMW. Inchcape, which will return £100 million of the sales proceeds to shareholders, said the disposal would leave it focused on distribution. The shares are up by 3.25%. The recruitment firm Page Group said today it had continued to reduce the size of its workforce after the slow end it saw to 2023 continued into this year. The company said it had let go 100 fee earners during the first 3 months of the year, taking the total over the last 12 months to 888. Page Group reported a gross profit of £219.7 million for the first 3 months of the year. That was down 12.8% on the same period last year. The shares are off by nearly 5%. Now, decarbonising everyday products is seen as playing a key role in mitigating climate change. Itaconix, listed on AIM, seeks to do this by replacing microplastics with plant-based polymers that can be used in products such as hair gel, detergents and deodorants. Well, today the company announced a 40% rise in full-year sales to $7.9 million, while pre-tax losses fell by 39% to $1.5 million. Well, joining me now is John Shaw. He's co-founder and chief executive of Itaconix. John, welcome to you. Your sales were up 40% during the year. How much of that came from volume and how much from price?
Most of that came from volume. We kept our prices pretty much the same. We increased our penetration into the cleaning products, beauty and hygiene applications across the board with volume.
And that's where you're seeing strongest demand right now, beauty and hygiene.
That area is growing for us, particularly post-pandemic. There was a lull in the pandemic. We see that as a high growth area in the future. It's also a very high margin area for us. Great opportunities for us to bring plant-based ingredients into consumer products.
What are the products applications, do you think, where you haven't quite applied the chemistry as much as you would like to?
Two big areas for us. First of all is in leather. Sustainable fashion is growing. The need to increase plant-based content in leather products. We think that's a high area of growth for us. And then the next one is right over my shoulder here is in artistic paints. This is our first professionally produced paint using our formulas in base chemicals in that one. So we see those as two big areas for us. And then long term in the future, super absorbents to go into hygiene products.
And in terms of the competitive landscape, John, talk me through that. Who are you up against?
We're up against a lot of traditional petrochemical-based chemistries and formulations that are out there. We sell, though, even though we are plant-based, our starting material is a natural metabolite found in our bodies, found in nature that we process into valuable ingredients. But we're primarily against fossil-based ingredients where we deliver better performance and better cost in certain applications and bring sustainability in. That's what's important to us in terms of decarbonizing, is that we are not asking consumers to pay a higher price. There's a lot of sense that consumers have to pay a high expense for climate change. There's certain market segments where we're doing it with at the same or lower price.
And is that message getting through to consumers, do you think? I mean, ultimately, obviously, you're more of a B2B business.
Correct, but we work with 50 to 100 different brands across North America and Europe. What they're seeing is the ability of our ingredients to bring valuable claims that consumers like. Only a small portion of it really is based on being plant-based. Most of it is around performance side of it, and everyone likes better performance at a lower cost, and that's what we like.
I mentioned the competitor landscape just a moment ago, John. What about the chemistry that you're utilising? Is anyone else doing that specifically?
We have a broad platform, about 16 patent families that protect our platform. I'm actually talking to you from our production facility. This is the only production facility of its like in the world. So we don't think there's any direct competitor. There are other routes that you can use some fossil-based ingredients to get there, but I think for our particular chemistry, we're it.
And how far off are you from being profitable at the pre-tax level, at the sort of headline level?
We're a couple of years away from it. I think we keep getting closer and closer. I think the fundraise that we did last year gave us plenty of cash. It's giving a lot more operating room in terms of negotiating better terms and better agreements with our customers so we can get our gross profit margins up. It's really a great new era of development for us.
OK, John, we have to leave it there. Good to talk to you today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Still to come here on Business Live, we'll take a look at how the markets have finished this afternoon. Stay with us.
When you cover big, tense protests, there's almost always a moment when the atmosphere changes. There's a different noise, and you start to smell tear gas in the air.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
When we spoke to the fishermen down in Cornwall, all the politics from Westminster was a million miles away. This was about their jobs, their livelihoods.
I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
If you forgot your pajamas, Emirates has got you covered. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Well, as I mentioned earlier on in the programme, the oil price has largely shrugged off Iran's attack on Israel over the weekend. A barrel of Brent crude currently changing hands at $89.21 a barrel. That's off just shy of 1.5% on the day. Well, foreign exchange markets, well, the US dollar has today hit its highest level against a basket of currencies since November last year. But as you can see, the dollar is off right now against sterling. I think much of that is influenced by the yen, dollar hitting a 34-year high against the Japanese currency today. On the equity markets, well, let me show you how European stocks have finished. Only the IBEX in Madrid in negative territory. I draw your attention to the DAX in Germany at the top left-hand of the screen there, gone back above 18,000, a level it first captured in February of this year. Talking points in mainland Europe today include Ageas, the Belgian insurer, which recently abandoned a takeover approach to the UK's direct line. That's risen by 3% after the French lender BNP Paribas bought a 9% stake from China's Fosun Group to become its biggest shareholder. Well, here in London, the FTSE 100 has finished to the downside, off just over a third of 1%, 30 points lower. 21 of those came from BP and Shell, obviously the oil price lower. The leading blue chip gainer today is Beazley Group. That's the Lloyd's insurer. That's up some 3% on gains on support from one of the brokers. Outside the FTSE 100, the outsourcing group Mighty is up by just over 6.5%. That's following a trading update, while the house builder Crest Nicholson, again, another stock benefiting from broker support today, up nearly 1.25% at the close. Over on Wall Street, well, the S&P 500 and the Dow have opened to the upside, and so too has the Nasdaq. It was lower a little earlier on today. Tesla, which I mentioned earlier on, that is off some 3% on those job cut reports. Notable gainer this afternoon is Goldman Sachs. It's ahead by some 3.5%. Its quarterly results beat expectations this afternoon. Well, joining me now is Anna Macdonald, Senior Equity Analyst at Sustineri Global Investment. Anna, great to see you as ever. Let's start with Tesla. What do you make of these job cut reports?
Well, there are more than reports. Elon Musk has written to employees saying that he's going to do a 10% cut to roles. He said that there's some duplications of roles and some job functions they need to cut. But I think the underlying story is they need to reduce costs. Deliveries really missed analyst expectations by quite some mark in early April. They missed expectations by 15%. And I think it's not just Tesla. EV demand has fallen, but they have got to do something to change their cost base, as they have almost doubled the number of employees over the last 3 years.
Elon Musk is very unhappy at some of the subsidies that the Chinese EV makers receive from their government. He's got a point, hasn't he?
Absolutely, it could be seen as unfair. Although I would say that if you look at some of those Chinese EV makers, such as Build Your Dreams, who did actually outproduce Tesla last quarter, they haven't quite kept up with Tesla this quarter. But they are also seeing really strongly shrinking demand, and that's also causing all the other manufacturers, whether they were traditional manufacturers as well, such as VW and Ford, to also scale back on some of their plans. And VW and Ford will be one of other manufacturers who are finding it tough to compete against the Chinese.
Yeah, well, staying on Wall Street, I mentioned Goldman Sachs a moment ago. Best quarterly results from them, I think, since 2021 today. What have you made of the results so far? I mean, JP Morgan took a bit of a turn for the downside on Friday.
Yeah, it's interesting. Goldman's, as you say, beat expectations, and they talked up the fact that capital markets are reopening, and they make a lot of money out of advisory fees and underwriting fees when you have more things like IPOs happening in the market. And Goldman Sachs are also talking about building up their asset and wealth management businesses, because those provide nice, consistent earnings streams and are not subject to the ups and downs and the vagaries of how healthy the primary capital markets are feeling. So that's Goldman's. But then if you look at JP Morgan, what they talked about was that net interest income wouldn't be hitting quite the levels that analysts were hoping for. Now, that's the difference that they get in the margin between what they lend out and what they have to pay to depositors who are putting their money with them. They've been a real beneficiary over the last few years as regional banks have been less attractive to receive those deposits. But as with anything, competition does out in the end, and they know they're going to have to pay depositors slightly higher interest rates, particularly if the Fed isn't going to be cutting rates anytime soon. So that's put pressure on them, and it led to an over 6% fall in the share price on Friday.
Anna, is there a read across to the British lenders on that front? Because obviously MPs have had quite a lot to say about the kind of rates that banks are paying depositors.
Yes, I mean, I think we're always going to see that tension, aren't we, between how much of the interest rate are you passing on, and the UK banks are under that same pressure. What's going to be kind of interesting, I guess, is if we are going to see that net interest income come under pressure anyway, as interest rates track downwards in the UK, because our inflation rates are falling faster than they are in the US. And with our economy being weaker than the US, perhaps there is some chance that the Bank of England and the ECB will cut slightly before the Fed does, even though that would be quite unusual.
You think the bank could go before the Fed?
Well, they could do. They will be really conscious about what that might do to sterling versus the dollar. But if you see the US retail sales today, they came in well ahead of expectations. The US economy seems to be really motoring still. And that does really put paid to the idea that the Fed is going to be cutting rates anytime soon. And if we are seeing inflation fall back towards target in the UK and the EU, perhaps there is a justification for the BOV, the Bank of England or the ECB to go first.
Anna, good to talk to you as ever. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
That's it from me. I'm back tomorrow morning at 11:30. Do stay tuned. Up next, it's Mark Austin with the News Hour. Cheerio.